The north was cold, but their blood ran warm. In Viking lands where snow blanketed rooftops and the sea howled like a god in mourning, intimacy was not hidden in the shadows. It lived by the hearth, among the mead cups, in the shared laughter of lovers, and the knowing glances exchanged under starlit skies. Desire wasn't whispered, it was sung. Unlike the cloistered shame of Christian Europe, the Norse saw the body as a vessel not of sin, but of strength and story. Flesh was not something to be punished, it was something to be honored, tested, tasted, and remembered. A woman's body was her own, protected by law, respected by custom. She could divorce her husband with witnesses and a voice raised, not in apology but in declaration. And when she chose a new partner, she didn't hide behind veils. She faced him with eyes steady and equal. Trial marriages for Lofnings were not only accepted, they were expected. A couple would live together, sometimes for a year, to test their compatibility, not just in labor or conversation, but in bed. If love blossomed, they married. If it didn't, they parted ways. No shame, no sin, just honesty. Wedding rituals were sacred acts, presided over by a gaudy, not a priest. They involved sacrifice, mead, oaths spoken not to a jealous god, but to each other, vows of loyalty, fertility, and shared strength. In some villages, the first night was celebrated publicly with songs, feasting, and carved runes placed at the threshold to bless the union. The man offered a sword, not as domination, but as a promise to protect. The woman in turn handed him a key, not as submission, but as a sign of trust. Virginity, it wasn't worshipped, it wasn't even mentioned. What mattered was not what you hadn't done, but what kind of person you were when you chose to do it. Viking women could own property, inherit land, and defend their rights in court. And if a man forced himself upon her, it was not her reputation that was stained, it was his. The punishment for rape was severe: fines, exile, even death. Consent was not a footnote, it was the foundation. And yet there were rules, not rules of purity, but of honor. If a man slept with another's wife, he might face death, not because of her virtue, but because of the breach in trust, the disruption of lineage and inheritance. Honor in the Norse world was currency, and betrayal its greatest thief. But if two people, unmarried and free, chose each other, the village didn't scorn them, it toasted to them. Even the sagas, echoing across generations, brim with sensuality. Heroes bedded shield maidens, gods seduced mortals. Freyja, goddess of love and war, was worshipped with offerings of pleasure, her temple floors sometimes scattered with rosewater and lovers' clothes. And yet the Christian monks, clutching their crucifixes, saw only depravity. They arrived in Norse lands and found a culture not ashamed of its skin. Women bathed openly, men embraced affection. There were no locked bedrooms or moral inquisitions. The missionaries, raised on the idea that sex was a weakness, recoiled, and so they wrote. They described the Vikings as lustful pagans, corrupt and animalistic. They mistook openness for chaos, freedom for filth. But what they witnessed was something else entirely: balance. To the Norse, sex was not just pleasure, it was power, a binding force between land and lineage, love and law. It could forge alliances and settle disputes. It could ruin men who broke trust and elevate women who wielded their bodies with wisdom. The longhouse was many things: a shelter, a feasting hall, a battlefield of ideas. But when night fell, it became something sacred, not a place of shame, a place of sovereignty. The body was not a burden, it was a banner, and the right to choose what it did, and with whom, was a freedom many would die to protect. The Vikings fought battles in the field, but they also fought in the home, for love, for consent, for pleasure without punishment. To them the body was a battlefield, but it wasn't always for war. They came by torchlight, not as an army, but as pilgrims, men and women cloaked in fur and silence, walking barefoot through the moss-laced woods. The moon was high, cold and watching, and at its center burned the sacred fire. In a clearing marked by stones older than kings, the smoke rose slowly, mingled with chanting. It was midsummer, blot night. These were not drunken revels, nor the orgies painted by trembling priests centuries later. No, these were rituals, controlled, deliberate, ancient, offerings made not in lust but in reverence to Freyja, goddess of beauty and battle, and her twin brother Freyr, lord of the harvest and the sacred seed. Their statues stood nearby, carved in deep wood, their forms unapologetically sensual, breasts full, phallus erect, symbols not of sin, but of life. At the edge of the circle stood the scythe Kona, a woman draped in antlers and shadow, the seeress, the speaker between worlds. her hands smeared with ochre, her mouth filled with song. Runes glowed faintly in the soil around her feet, carved earlier that day into the ground with a blade passed from mother to daughter. She raised her arms, and the chant deepened. Couples stepped forward, one by one. Some married, some not. It didn't matter. They laid down beside the fire, clothed in garlands and consent. Around them the people watched, not with hunger but with honor. These acts were sacred. What bound their bodies would bless the harvest, seal the tribe, carry the dead home. There were herbs in the air, burning roots, powdered mushrooms, bark soaked in honeyed mead. They dulled pain, heightened breath. Some said they brought visions, others said they brought gods. In the shadows the missionary watched. He had followed them from the village, curious, trembling, holding his crucifix like a shield. When he saw what they did, he fell to his knees. To him it was madness, animalistic, sinful, but he didn't understand what he saw. He didn't hear the consent in their voices, the invocation in their rhythm, the structure behind every movement. This was not chaos, it was choreography. Later, he would write of witches dancing naked, of beasts summoned from the ground, of Satan whispering in a woman's ear. But he never wrote of the rules, that there were boundaries, that no child could take part, that no force was allowed, that those who violated the sacred rites were shunned, banished, sometimes executed. He didn't write that in these rituals, women-led. The Scythe Kona, feared and respected, was not just a priestess. She was a vessel of Freya herself. She chose when the rite began. She chose who entered. Her word was law, not a husband's, not a chieftain's, not a god's. In one rite, the dead were honored through union. Couples made love atop burial mounds, not out of lewdness, but in devotion. The Norse believed that life and death were twins, that in the moments where bodies joined, the spirits could speak. Children conceived on these nights were said to carry the wisdom of the ancestors. To the outsider it was horror, to the Norse it was heritage, and as Christianity spread its shadow across the north, these rites became the first to be hunted. Priests demanded confessions, fires were lit, statues burned. The Scythe Kona were declared witches, and the bloats called orgies of the devil. What they didn't understand they destroyed, what they couldn't control they labeled as evil, and yet the rites continued. In hidden valleys, in glades untouched by church bells, symbols were carved smaller, worn under tunics, hidden in braids. The sacred mushrooms were renamed priestbane. The chants became lullabies passed to daughters as they brushed their hair. What was once public became secret, but it was never lost, because for the Norse, sexuality wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. The joining of bodies mirrored the weaving of fate, life begetting life, lust as worship, pleasure as prophecy. The missionary fled, clutching his crucifix, but he had seen something he could never unsee. A circle of fire, a woman with eyes like thunder, and a people who believed that the divine could be touched, with hands, with lips, with the full trembling weight of human flesh. To the church it was madness, to the Norse it was memory, and memories they knew do not die. The battlefield shifted, not with swords but with names, not with blood but with shame. As the missionaries pushed deeper into the north, they found not only naked rites and sacred sex, but something more threatening, something they didn't have a word for: power in the wrong hands, women with authority, men without submission, genders that didn't fit their holy books, and worst of all, people who weren't ashamed of any of it. In Viking society, the lines were never clean. Masculinity was not fragile, it was fierce, flexible, fluid. Women could own ships, lands, temples. They led raids, commanded homesteads, and when necessary, they fought with axes. The shield maiden was no myth. She was a warrior in a linen skirt, standing knee-deep in enemy blood. But power didn't only live on the battlefield. In the home, Viking women could divorce a man without fear. No priest, no scandal, just a declaration before witnesses and the return of her dowry. She could take a new lover, bear children without disgrace, and claim her rightful share of inheritance. In the sagas, there were women who seduced kings, men who dressed in women's cloaks to channel the gods, and warriors who bore both softness and violence like twin blades. The priests didn't understand, so they condemned. The word ergi appears in Old Norse, a term dripping with contempt, but it didn't mean what the Christians assumed. It wasn't about homosexuality. It wasn't about desire. It was about dishonor, weakness, deceit, the betrayal of expected roles. A man who seduced another man's wife might be called argia, a warrior who backed down from battle, a man who used sorcery, the feminine magic of Scyther, to manipulate fate. But even then, Odin, the Allfather himself, was said to have practiced Scyther, to have worn women's robes, to have whispered spells with a woman's tongue. He was mocked for it and worshipped anyway. That was the paradox the church could not bear. Because where the church punished femininity outside of submission, the Norse wielded it. In longhouses, men and women flirted without guilt. Songs were sung of same-sex love, not always proudly, but not always hidden. In court records, there are traces of disputes over lovers, not because they were of the same gender, but because of broken oaths. In Iceland's Grægos law code, punishments existed for slander. Accusing someone of being argur without proof could cost you your tongue, because even then, the Norse knew that words were weapons, and identity was something to be defended. The missionaries tried to erase this. They brought sermons about Adam and Eve, about shame and rib birth, and women cursed to obey. They taught that the body was a trap, that lust led to hell, that desire was the devil's whisper. But the North was not listening. In the village of Uppsala, priests discovered statues of gods with erect phalluses, breasts bared, hips wide. They destroyed them, burned them, buried them, but they returned, carved smaller, hidden deeper, inked into skin. In the sagas we find echoes of resistance, stories where women mock priests, where men take lovers across gender lines, where gods laugh at rules. It wasn't always accepted, but it was acknowledged, lived, and even in the face of conversion, it endured. A mother whispering old prayers to her daughter during her wedding night, a man wearing his grandmother's pendant, shaped like Phrygia's yoni beneath his Christian tunic, a warrior kissing another man before battle, just once, under the moon, before the killing began. They called it pagan, but it was power, intimate, unapologetic power. The church could control who was crowned, but it could not control who was touched, and that's what terrified them, because shame is only a weapon if your enemy believes in it. And the Norse never did. In the end, the priests brought guilt, but the Norse brought gods, and their gods didn't care who you loved, only how fiercely you did it. It didn't happen all at once. There was no great war, no last stand with axes raised and gods howling from the mountaintops. No, the death of Viking sexuality came quietly, not with iron but with ink and ash, with sermons whispered over children's cradles, with laws rewritten in darkened abbeys, with the slow suffocation of memory. The cross arrived not on horseback but on parchment, bringing sin where there had been story, bringing guilt where there had been fire. The rituals, once performed in moonlit clearings and midsummer fields, were outlawed. The old gods were rebranded as demons. Freya, the goddess of love and lust and life, was now a whore. Freyr, the sacred masculine, a devil in disguise. And the women who once danced in circles of birch and blood were labeled witches, hunted, hung, burned. The longhouses grew quiet. The runes were no longer carved in doorways. The phallic idols were buried beneath hearthstones or broken apart in fear of raids. The Scythekonur, those priestesses of sensual knowledge, vanished into the woods or were dragged into Christian courts. Many died. Some remained silent for the rest of their lives. A few passed their knowledge in code, recipes that were really spells, lullabies that whispered of old gods in secret rhyme. In place of the sacred bed came the confessional. In place of trial marriages came forced unions, arranged not for love or balance but for property and punishment. Virginity became currency, female desire, a sickness. The open sacred rituals of consent and erotic devotion were recast as perversions, and yet the fire flickered still. In dark corners of frozen valleys, a woman still lit candles on Freyja's night. In lonely halls where a Christian priest ruled, a child still wore a carved Thor's hammer under their tunic, pressed tight to their heart. In the woods, couples still made love under the moon, not because they defied the church, but because their bodies remembered something the books had tried to erase. The Christian world rewrote the Viking body, not by violence, but by making it invisible. They taught that passion was sin, that the self must be broken, that the flesh was filthy, and perhaps worst of all, they called it purification. But behind the heavy doors of stone chapels, the scent of mead and sweat still haunted the walls. Behind every altar, the ghosts of gods with open arms still waited, not to punish, but to remind. There are records from the 11th and 12th centuries, obscure, suppressed, of bishops disturbed by reports of women gathering in groves, invoking fertility with herbs and chants, of men dressing in women's garb, whispering Odin's name in strange, lilting tongues. These were not isolated acts of rebellion. They were echoes, and even the priests began to tremble, not at violence but at memory, because a sword you can fight, but a belief you tried to erase and failed, that is a curse. By the 1300s, much of the Old Norse sexual world had vanished from law, from story, from record, but not from blood, not from dream. The stories persisted, warped, hidden, passed like a fever, and in them the gods still danced. Freya still wept golden tears, Freyr still rose with the sun and the seed, and the people, though silenced, still touched each other with reverence. In the end, it wasn't the axe that lost, it was the fire. But fire, even when buried, never dies. Beneath the churches they built, in the crypts and stones, the heat still lingers, a secret warmth in the coldest nights, a reminder that the old gods may have been buried, but they were never burned. And in the bedroom, behind closed doors, skin on skin some say, the Norse are still whispering. He wrote of beasts and witches, of bodies writhing in the dirt, of chants that sounded like curses. But what the missionary really saw that night, what haunted him until his final breath, was freedom, a kind of freedom the world he came from had already forgotten. Viking sexuality wasn't a spectacle, it was a statement that the body was sacred, that pleasure was not a sin, that love in any form was a force worthy of gods. To the outside world they were monsters because they didn't kneel, because they kissed without guilt, because they let women speak and let men weep, and drew no line where the soul began or ended. The cross tried to cage that, but desire once made divine cannot be contained, and so centuries later, when we whisper of the Vikings, we speak of their ships, their raids, their wars, but we forget the softer revolution, the one that happened in bedrooms, under firs, beneath stars, a revolution of touch, of choice, of knowing yourself without shame. In the end, the Christian world feared their axes, but what they feared more was their freedom in the dark.